Nancy Brown, stop
I'm not
talking.
saying one more word without my AFSCME rep present.
The federal warrant doesn't require a state union representative.
I'm not answering
Federal.
The search warrant for Nancy Brown's workstation was signed weeks before this moment. What agents found recorded above her desk is the reason she's being handcuffed right now. 213 real, government-issued driver's licenses sold to people who never showed a single document to prove who they were.
Program bribery. You are in federal custody now.
I am a state employee and I have rights and I'm not going one step.
214 licenses, 15 months, between $1,500 and $3,000 per click of a mouse. By the time Homeland Security Investigations walked into the Nevada DMV office on East Sahara Avenue, the woman in the chair had quietly sold the foundational identity document of American civic life to 214 strangers who had never produced a single piece of identification. Every license was real. Everyone was logged in the state system. Everyone was already in someone's wallet, being used at airports, at banks, and at federal buildings across the country. Before we go any further, have you ever stopped to think about how much of your life rests on the person behind the DMV counter clicking approve? Drop a comment and let me know if this case changes how you think about that little piece of plastic in your wallet. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We hold authority figures accountable every single week, and the people who control the documents you depend on are exactly the kind of authority this channel exists to watch. Nancy Brown was born in 1982 in North Las Vegas, Nevada, in the slow stretch of low desert-tract neighborhoods north of Cheyenne Avenue, in a small two-bedroom rental her mother had taken after a divorce in 1979. Her mother worked the breakfast and lunch shifts at a coffee shop inside one of the off-strip casinos, came home with the smell of bacon grease still in her hair, and put a plate of food on the table for Nancy at 4 in the afternoon every day before going back for the late dinner rush. Nancy was an only child. She did her homework on the kitchen counter while her mother counted tips out of a coffee can. The family had been in Clark County since the late 70s, when Nancy's grandfather followed a hotel construction job out of Bakersfield and never went back. Her uncle drove a forklift at a beverage distribution warehouse near McCarran. Her grandmother kept a folding table set up in the corner of the living room for puzzles. Nancy grew up inside the version of Las Vegas that tourists never see. Strip malls with check-cashing storefronts, swap meets in summer parking lots, schools with portable classrooms in the back lot to handle a population that doubled every decade. The neon of the Strip glowed 13 miles south of her bedroom window and might as well have been a different country. She attended El Dorado High School in Sunrise Manor, graduated in 2000, and enrolled at the College of Southern Nevada for general studies the following fall. She did not finish. The course load competed with a job at a strip mall nail salon, and the job won. She dropped out after 3 semesters and rotated through a sequence of clerical and customer-facing positions over the next 4 years. Receptionist at a chiropractor's office, file clerk at a mortgage company that closed in 2006, weekend hostess at a chain steakhouse on Charleston Boulevard. The pay topped out somewhere just above $10 an hour. The rent on her apartment was rising every 12 months. In the spring of 2007, Nancy Brown applied for a clerk position with the Nevada Department of Motor Vehicles. The application listed her recent customer service work and her partial college credits. She passed the state hiring screen, completed 2 weeks of paid training at the agency's training center off Decatur, and was assigned to the busy East Sahara Avenue office in central Las Vegas. Her starting wage was approximately $15 an hour with a full state benefits package, health insurance, dental, and enrollment in the Nevada Public Employees Retirement System. For Nancy Brown, who had grown up watching her mother count tips out of a coffee can, it was the first job that came with a defined retirement plan. Her evaluations from those first years were unremarkable in the way most state employee evaluations are unremarkable. Supervisors described her as reliable, works well with customers in high-volume environments, and demonstrates competence with the credentialing terminal. One supervisor noted that she was patient with applicants whose first language is not English, a phrase that, in retrospect, reads differently than it did at the time. Another noted she was willing to pick up extra Saturday shifts. She was promoted into a slightly higher pay grade in 2009. She did not have her own office. She had a station, one of roughly 20 terminals arranged along the customer service line at the East Sahara branch, separated from the lobby by a low partition and a sliding panel of laminated glass. Outside of work, her life looked the way the lives of 25 and 26-year-old Las Vegans look. She rented a one-bedroom apartment on Pecos Road, drove a 2004 Honda Civic that her uncle had helped her finance, met friends for breakfast at the Omelet House on Charleston, occasionally drove up to Mount Charleston on her weekend off to escape the heat. She was single. She had not been to Europe. She had not been to college. She had paid down approximately $4,000 of her remaining $10,000 in student loans. She had $843 in her savings account on the morning of February 1st, 2010, the date the federal complaint would later identify as roughly when her arrangement with the third-party recruiters began. The gap between what she earned and what the city she lived in cost was the steady, uneventful gap that millions of frontline state employees live with. She had not, by any reading of her financial records before February of 2010, been overspending. She had not gotten into trouble with a credit card. She had not been running up gambling losses. She did not, that anyone who knew her could later identify, have a single visible reason to do what she was about to do. There would be no story in the months that followed her arrest of medical bills or a sick relative or a foreclosure threat. There would only be the offer that came her way, the math of how much money it represented, and her decision to say yes. To understand what Nancy Brown sold, the audience has to understand what a Nevada driver's license actually is. It is not, at the level of federal law, a state document with state-only consequence. A Nevada driver's license is one of the foundational identity documents of American life. It is accepted at every Transportation Security Administration checkpoint, at every commercial airport in the United States. It is accepted by every federally insured bank to open an account. It is accepted at federal buildings for entry. It is the breeder document that other identity documents, Social Security number reissues, passport applications, employment authorization verifications, are built on top of. The card itself is small. The chain of trust it represents is enormous. The Nevada DMV branch on East Sahara Avenue is one of the busiest in the state. On a typical weekday, it processes between 1,200 and 1,500 customers. Applicants arrive in the morning, take a numbered ticket from a kiosk near the entrance, sit on rows of plastic chairs in the central lobby, and wait for an electronic board to call their number to one of the 20-plus customer service windows along the back wall. The wait is famously long. 2 to 3 hours is normal. 4 is not unusual. The architecture of the office is the architecture of patience. The credentialing process itself is straightforward in design and rigid in policy. An applicant approaches a clerk's window. The clerk verifies the applicant's identity against a set of source documents. For a first-time Nevada license, that means a certified birth certificate or a U.S. passport or for lawfully present non-citizens, an unexpired immigration document, together with proof of legal presence and proof of Nevada residency. The clerk enters the applicant's biographical information into the state's credentialing system, attaches scanned images of the source documents, captures a digital photograph using a camera mounted at the workstation, and prints a temporary paper credential. The plastic license itself is mailed from a central production facility within 2 to 3 weeks. The clerk's user credentials are logged with every entry. The system knows for every license it issues who pressed the keys. What the system does not do is verify in real time whether the source documents the clerk says she scanned were actually presented. The scanned images go into the file. A second-tier reviewer in a separate office spot checks a percentage of submissions. But the clerk at the window is the first and only person who physically lays eyes on the documents before the digital record is created. If she clicks through the screen that asks her to confirm that she has examined a valid birth certificate, the system accepts that confirmation. There is no biometric check. There is no fingerprint match against a federal database. There is no callback. The chain of trust runs from a federal funding grant, through state policy, through one clerk at one window, to a piece of plastic mailed to an address. The weakness was not that the policy was unwritten. The policy was written, and Nancy Brown had been trained on it. The weakness was that the policy could only be enforced by the clerk herself, in real time, in a busy lobby where supervisors were not standing behind her shoulder, while a line of 200 angry customers waited for their numbers to be called. The Nevada DMV had built a system that, at the moment of issuance, depended on the integrity of a single employee at a single terminal. The federal government had built a downstream architecture, airports, banks, federal buildings, that depended on the integrity of that single employee at a single terminal, multiplied across 50 states and thousands of branches. The federal complaint dated the start of the scheme to roughly February of 2010, 3 years into Nancy Brown's employment, well past the period when a new clerk might have made an honest mistake out of unfamiliarity with the system. The complaint identified the mechanism as the involvement of third-party recruiters. The recruiters operated in the immigrant communities of the Las Vegas Valley, the Spanish-language radio listening audience, the East Sahara Taqueria customer base, the construction day laborer pickup corners along Boulder Highway. They advertised, by word of mouth, that they could obtain a real Nevada driver's license for an undocumented person for between $1,500 and $3,000, cash. The customers paid the third party. The third party paid a smaller cut to Nancy Brown. The prosecutorial filings did not specify her exact share, but the structure was consistent with how such schemes are typically operated. Roughly half of the gross to the clerk. The remainder retained by the recruiter as overhead and personal profit. The customers were then given instructions. They were told the address of the East Sahara DMV. They were told to enter the lobby. They were told to sit in a specific area of the waiting room, near a particular set of chairs, close to the customer service line. They were told to wait and not to take a number from the kiosk. They were told that the clerk who was going to help them would motion to them when she was ready. The choreography mattered. The customers did not take a ticket because taking a ticket would have entered them into the queue management system and routed them randomly to one of the 20 available clerks. They needed to be routed specifically to Nancy Brown. The only way to do that was to bypass the queue entirely. So they sat in the lobby in a specific cluster of chairs, holding nothing. No birth certificate, no immigration document, no proof of residency. They waited for a wave of a hand from a clerk at a particular window. When the wave came, they walked up to her window and sat down across from her. The interaction at the window was brief by DMV standards. 5 to 7 minutes for what would normally be a 15 to 20-minute encounter. Brown entered the biographical information the customer recited. The customer's information was sometimes a real identity, sometimes a manufactured one. Brown clicked through the screens that asked her to confirm she had examined source documents. She had not. She entered placeholder document numbers, or numbers that corresponded to documents that did not exist. Or she used techniques that the subsequent investigation would identify as exploiting specific known weaknesses in the system's verification flow. She took the customer's photograph at the workstation camera. She printed the temporary paper credential. She handed it across the partition. The customer left. 2 to 3 weeks later, a real Nevada driver's license arrived in the mail at the address the customer had provided. The volume escalated. In the first months, the federal complaint suggested, the transactions came in singly or in pairs across a given week. By the middle of 2010, the pattern had thickened into a steady stream, multiple customers per day, sometimes clustered in a single morning when a particular recruiter had brought a group. The complaint would later identify approximately 214 licenses issued over the 15-month operational window. At the lower estimated price of $1,500 per license, the gross revenue across the operation came to roughly $320,000. At the higher rate of $3,000, it came to $640,000. Brown's personal cut, if it was half, fell somewhere between $160,000 and $320,000 over the same window. Her ordinary clerk's salary across that period was roughly $40,000. The signs that something was wrong existed inside the building. Other clerks would later tell investigators that they had noticed Brown calling customers from a particular section of the lobby. They had noticed that her customers seemed to leave faster than the average. They had noticed that her customers sometimes arrived without folders, without documents, without anything in their hands at all. None of them had filed a complaint. None of them had said anything to a supervisor. They had assumed, in the way people in busy government offices assume, that there was an explanation they were not privy to, that the customers had pre-submitted documents online, that the lead at the front desk had vouched for them, that someone else was responsible for the verification. The system had a chain of trust. Inside the building, the chain was also a chain of unspoken assumption. Brown's lifestyle changed only modestly during the operational period, modestly enough that the changes did not trigger any internal review. She traded the Honda Civic for a slightly newer used vehicle in the summer of 2010. She moved from her one-bedroom apartment on Pecos to a slightly larger one-bedroom in a newer complex closer to the Strip. She bought her mother a refrigerator. She did not buy a house. She did not buy jewelry. She did not take a luxury vacation. The money came in cash, in envelopes, handed off in parking lots away from the DMV building, and most of it sat in a series of small deposits to her checking account and in a strongbox at her apartment. A federal forensic accountant would later catalog the deposits and identify them as inconsistent with her reported income. At the time, no one was looking. The case began with a phone call. The federal complaint identified the date only as a day in September of 2010, roughly 7 months into the operation, with around 100 licenses already issued. The chief of the Nevada DMV's Compliance Enforcement Division received a tip from an unnamed individual that 2 specific persons had fraudulently obtained Nevada driver's licenses through a DMV employee. The tip did not name Nancy Brown. It named the two licenses by license number, and it identified the suspected mechanism as the involvement of a clerk at a Las Vegas branch. The identity of the tipster was never made public in the prosecution. The shape of the tip, two specific license numbers, knowledge of the mechanism, suggested someone with access to the recruiting end of the operation. The federal complaint did not speculate. It noted only that the tip was credible enough to trigger an internal compliance enforcement review, which pulled the two licenses from the state database, examined the credentialing records, and confirmed that the source documents listed on both applications could not be located in the supporting file system. The applications had been processed. The verifications had been clicked. But the documents the verifications referred to did not exist. Compliance enforcement pulled the clerk records. Both licenses had been issued by the same workstation, by the same user credentials, on dates roughly 6 weeks apart. The clerk was Nancy Brown. The Compliance Division then pulled the full list of licenses Brown had issued over the preceding 6 months. The list was hundreds long, the way every busy clerk's list was hundreds long. A statistical review of the supporting documentation revealed a problem. A significantly above average percentage of Brown's recent applications had file irregularities, missing source document scans that appeared to be reused across multiple applicants, biographical entries that did not cross-match against secondary state databases. The internal review escalated. The Nevada DMV referred the matter to the Department of Homeland Security because the federal implication of an identity document compromise, driver's licenses being issued to persons unlawfully in the United States, placed the case squarely in HSI jurisdiction. Homeland Security investigations opened a file. They did not move on Brown immediately. They moved on the operation. For several months between late 2010 and early 2011, HSI conducted background work, interviewing customers identified from the compromised licenses, tracing the third-party recruiters, mapping the financial flow. One of those interviews changed the structure of the case. HSI agents identified a woman, a recent customer of one of the recruiters, who had paid $3,000 for a Nevada driver's license. The agents approached her. She agreed to cooperate in exchange for a 1-year U.S. work permit. She told the agents the precise mechanism. She had paid the recruiter $3,000 in cash in a parking lot off Maryland Parkway. She had been given an address on East Sahara, told to go to the DMV, told to sit near the windows, told to wait for a particular clerk to wave her over. She had done all of those things. She had been processed by a black female clerk at a specific window. She had not been asked for any documents. 2 weeks later, the license had arrived at the address she had given. She still had it in her wallet on the day the agents knocked on her door. That statement gave HSI everything they needed for the next step. They had confirmed, from a first-person source, the choreography of the operation. They had identified the workstation. They had identified the clerk. What they did not yet have was a way to capture, in evidentiary form, the live conduct, the wave from the window, the customer arriving without documents, the click through the screens. They needed footage. In February of 2011, with the cooperation of the Nevada DMV's internal management, Homeland Security Investigations installed a covert camera. The camera was positioned directly above Nancy Brown's assigned workstation. The lens looked straight down at her desk, at the partition window, and at the chair on the other side where a customer would sit. The camera ran for approximately 3 months. Over that window, the federal complaint would later state, the camera captured at least 10 separate transactions consistent with the choreography the cooperating witness had described. The pattern in the footage was identical from one transaction to the next. A customer would appear in the lobby, not in the line at the kiosk, not with a folder of documents in hand, but seated in the specific area of the waiting room the cooperating witness had identified. Brown would wave the customer forward. The customer would approach her window. The interaction would last between 5 and 8 minutes. The customer would walk away with a printed temporary credential. The camera caught Brown's hands on the keyboard. The camera caught her face at the screen. The camera caught the customer leaving without any documents changing hands across the partition. The footage was time-stamped and date-stamped on federal recording equipment. Each of the 10 captured transactions was cross-referenced against the Nevada DMV's credentialing database for the same date and time, on the same workstation, by the same user credentials. The match was clean. The license numbers came up. The recipient names came up. The fact that the recipients had no supporting documentation in the system came up. The two records, the federal video and the state database, together told a complete story. HSI agents also worked the financial side. They served subpoenas on Brown's bank accounts. They identified a pattern of small cash deposits, almost all of them below the $10,000 threshold that would have triggered automatic federal reporting. Almost all of them clustered around dates that corresponded to license issuances captured by the camera or recorded in the state database. The amounts did not match Brown's reported income. The deposits had no documented source. They were, in the language of the eventual complaint, consistent with the unreported receipt of cash bribes. The agents identified at least 2 of the third-party recruiters through the cooperating witness and through their own surveillance of the parking lot handoff locations. The recruiters were Latino men in their 30s and 40s, operating with cell phones that turned over every few months, taking cash and meeting customers at fixed times at fixed locations. The recruiters were tracked, but in the initial phase of the investigation, were not arrested. The federal strategy was to build the case against the central node, the clerk, first. By April of 2011, the case file contained everything a federal prosecutor needed. There was direct video evidence of 10 transactions. There were 214 issued licenses in the Nevada DMV database tied to Brown's user credentials, every one of them processed without the supporting documentation that state and federal policy required. There was a cooperating witness who had personally executed the choreography Brown directed. There were financial records consistent with the receipt of cash bribes. There was a paper trail running back over 15 months. The prosecutor's office prepared a federal complaint charging Brown under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 666, Federal Program Bribery, the statute that applies to bribery of agents of state agencies that receive more than $10,000 in federal funding. The Nevada DMV qualified under that threshold many times over through federal driver's license grant programs and Real ID compliance funding. The maximum exposure on the charge was 10 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine. The federal complaint was filed on April 29, 2011. It was filed under seal, meaning that Nancy Brown, going to work that morning at the East Sahara DMV, did not know that a federal magistrate judge in Las Vegas had signed a document authorizing her arrest. She worked her shift. She processed customers. The camera above her workstation was still running. We're heading into the arrest now. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. We don't dress up these stories. We don't oversell them. We give you the documents, the timeline, and the consequences. Subscribe. The way this case actually ends, and the institutional question it leaves behind, are worth seeing through to the last frame. May 5th, 2011 was a Thursday. The lobby of the East Sahara DMV opened at 8 in the morning. By 8:30, the waiting area was 3/4 full, and the digital number board was already calling tickets in the high 200s. Nancy Brown had clocked in at 7:45, taken her coffee from the break room machine, sat down at her workstation, and begun the day's queue. By 10:15, she had processed 11 applicants. None of them, on the morning's surveillance review, were among the choreographed customers. The morning was, by every external measure, an ordinary morning. At approximately 10:30, 2 HSI special agents entered the East Sahara branch through the employee entrance at the back of the building. They were accompanied by a supervisor from the Nevada DMV's Compliance Enforcement Division. They moved quietly through the rear corridor and emerged behind the customer service line, behind Brown's chair. A supervisor approached Brown's workstation and asked her to step away from the terminal. The customer she had been helping, a man renewing a license, looked up in confusion. The lead agent spoke first. "Nancy Brown?" "Yes. We're with Homeland Security Investigations. We need you to come with us. There's a federal warrant for your arrest. We can do this quietly. Stand up slowly and step away from the keyboard." Brown did not stand. She looked at the screen in front of her, then at the customer on the other side of the partition, then at the supervisor she had worked under for 4 years. Her hand stayed in her lap. For what? "Federal program bribery. We'll explain it at the field office. Stand up, please." The customer on the other side of the partition began to back away. A clerk at the next station stood up to look. Brown stood up slowly. She did not reach for her purse. She did not reach for the phone. The agent nearest her gestured for her to step out from behind the workstation. She did. The second agent took her left elbow lightly. Her badge, the laminated DMV employee badge clipped to the front of her polo, was still on her chest. The supervisor reached forward and unclipped it. "Am I being handcuffed here?" "Not in front of the customers. We'll do that in the back. Walk with us." They walked her through the customer service area, behind the partition, past the row of working colleagues who had stopped what they were doing to watch. They walked her down the rear corridor. At the back door, in the staff-only loading area where the HSI vehicle was parked, the lead agent advised her of her rights and placed her in handcuffs. She did not cry. She did not protest. She asked one question. "How long have you been watching?" The lead agent did not answer. The complaint had been filed 6 days earlier. The camera above her workstation had been running for 3 months. The cooperating witness had given her statement 4 months before that. The tip to compliance enforcement had come in 7 months before that. The chain of trust she had been monetizing for 15 months had been broken for a year, and she had been the only person in the building who did not know. The federal complaint was unsealed on May 6, 2011, the day after the arrest. The single count of federal program bribery under 18 U.S.C. 666 alleged that Nancy Brown, from approximately February of 2010 to April 30, 2011, had corruptly received cash bribes from individuals unlawfully in the United States in exchange for issuing approximately 215 authentic Nevada driver's licenses. The complaint detailed the choreography, the third-party recruiters, the lobby seating, the wave from the window, the processing without documents, and it itemized the camera footage and the database records that established the conduct. The maximum exposure on the single count was 10 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine, plus a term of supervised release. The U.S. District Court for the District of Nevada in Las Vegas was the venue. Brown's initial appearance was conducted the same week. She was represented by counsel. She did not enter a plea at the arraignment. She was released on conditions pending further proceedings: a recognizance bond, restrictions on travel outside the District of Nevada, surrender of her passport, prohibition from contact with any current or former Nevada DMV employee. The conditions were standard for a defendant with no criminal history facing a first felony charge. She returned to her apartment near the Strip. She did not return to the DMV building. Her employment had been terminated at the moment the supervisor unclipped her badge. The Nevada DMV, in a statement issued the same week as the unsealing, announced the canceling of the 214 fraudulent licenses. The agency stated that it would send certified letters to each license holder informing them of the cancellation. The agency stated that it would alert other licensing agencies, meaning the DMVs of the other 49 states, the Federal Transportation Security Administration database, and the Federal Social Security Administration, that the licenses on the list had been issued without supporting documentation and were to be treated as compromised. The cancellation itself was straightforward. The retrieval of the canceled cards from the wallets of the recipients was not. The cards had circulated for up to 15 months. They had been used at airports. They had been used to open bank accounts. They had been used to obtain other identity documents that had then become breeder documents in their own right. The downstream contamination of the federal identity verification system from those 214 licenses would be effectively impossible to fully unwind. The months between arrest and plea were unremarkable. Brown's attorney negotiated with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Nevada. The government's evidence was, by any defense attorney's assessment, overwhelming. The video footage existed. The cooperating witness existed. The database records existed. The financial records existed. The prosecutorial decision tree narrowed quickly. A trial would have required the government to publicly air the operational mechanism of the scheme. The third-party recruiters, the choreography, the institutional weaknesses, in ways that the DMV and the federal government had reasons to limit. A guilty plea, by contrast, resolved the criminal question on Brown without further public airing of the operational details. The terms were negotiated. On Tuesday, December 6, 2011, in the U.S. District Court for the District of Nevada, Nancy Brown pleaded guilty to one count of federal program bribery under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 666. The plea was entered before a magistrate judge and accepted. The factual basis recited at the plea hearing acknowledged that Brown had, between February of 2010 and April of 2011, accepted cash payments in exchange for the issuance of authentic Nevada driver's licenses to persons unlawfully in the United States. The number stipulated was approximately 214 licenses. The price per license range stipulated was $1,500 to $3,000. The receipt of bribes through third-party recruiters was stipulated. Brown answered the magistrate's standard plea colloquy questions in a quiet voice. Her sentencing was scheduled before U.S. District Judge Philip M. Pro for March 6, 2012, approximately 3 months later. The sentencing exposure was 10 years statutory maximum. The federal sentencing guidelines, calculated against the loss amount, the number of fraudulent transactions, the position of trust, and the absence of prior criminal history, fell into a range that defense counsel and the government would each litigate at the sentencing hearing. Federal program bribery prosecutions involving public employees in positions of credentialing trust typically yielded sentences in the range of 2 to 5 years of imprisonment, depending on aggravating and mitigating factors. The position of trust enhancement was applicable to Brown. The 214-count multiplicity was applicable. The absence of prior convictions, the entry of a guilty plea, and the acceptance of responsibility were mitigating factors. The larger structural questions raised by the case did not move with Brown's case file. The Nevada DMV, in the months following the arrest, announced internal reviews of its credentialing workflow and its workstation oversight procedures. The agency considered, but did not initially implement, real-time supervisory review of every application processed by clerks identified through statistical review as having unusual patterns. The agency considered, but did not initially implement, biometric verification at the point of issuance. The agency considered, but did not initially implement, the installation of permanent surveillance cameras above every credentialing workstation. The questions the Brown case asked about how a state credentialing system that issues hundreds of millions of identity documents protects itself against the single terminal operator who decides to monetize her own access were the same questions that subsequent DMV scandals in California, in Florida, in Maryland, in Pennsylvania would continue to ask in the years that followed. The chain of trust had not been redesigned. The single weak link, which sits in the chair, was still a chair. Nancy Brown, on the date of her plea, was 28 years old. She had worked 4 years at the DMV before the operation began. She had run the operation for 15 months. The federal complaint that closed the operation had been authored in 6 days. The plea had taken 7 months. The case had begun on a date in September of 2010, with a single phone call from an unnamed individual whose own role in the surrounding ecosystem of recruiters and customers was never publicly identified. The 214 licenses she had issued were on a list that, by the date of her plea, had been distributed to every state DMV and to the Federal Transportation Security Administration. The card itself was small. The chain of trust it represented was enormous. The chain had broken at one chair on one Thursday morning when 2 federal agents walked through a back door at 10:30 in the morning and put their hand on her elbow. This case was quiet on the outside and structural on the inside. But this case on the right-hand side asked the same question in a setting where the consequences ran in human bodies instead of plastic cards. Click it now.